Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into alternate history today.
Oh, fun.
Yeah, it's always interesting to kind of think about those what if moments in history.
Absolutely.
And we'll be drawing from a book by Mental Floss. It's called What If? 19 Alternate Histories Imagining a Very Different World.
Okay.
It was published back in 2013.
Right.
But I think the scenarios are just as relevant today. You know, they make you think about how things could have been so different.
For sure.
And we're going to uncover some really surprising ripple effects, you know? Some are kind of funny, some are a bit chilling. But all of them, I think, will really make you think differently about the past.
I'm ready.
Yeah. So to kind of help us navigate this, we've grouped the what-if scenarios into themes. And I thought a good place to start would be with political and military power.
Yeah, I like that. Because it always makes me think, like, what if this leader made a different decision or this battle had a different outcome, you know? Yeah. It just shows how fragile things can be.
Absolutely. And it speaks to those anxieties we have, you know, about leadership, war, the balance of global power.
Definitely.
So let's just jump right in and maybe start with a classic what if. What if the South had actually won the Civil War?
Oh, that's a big one.
It is a big one. And, you know, we have two very different perspectives on this in the book.
Okay, interesting. Like totally opposite takes.
Yeah, pretty much.
Okay, okay.
So there's McKinley Cantor, who wrote a piece for Look magazine in 1960, and he actually presents a pretty optimistic view.
Really?
Yeah, he imagines a divided America, but one that eventually reunites in 1960 after Texas has its own little stint as an independent republic.
Wow. So like Texas just goes its own way for a while.
Right. But in the end, America finds its way back together. I think it speaks to his belief in the American ideal, you know, that even after decades of division, unity could prevail.
That's interesting. A more hopeful outlook. But like, what's the darker side of this? What if?
Well, that comes from Harry Turtledove. He's got this multi-volume series where the Civil War basically never really ends.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the wounds just fester, leading to a fascist Confederate States of America and a series of global conflicts that pretty much devastate the 20th century.
That's a lot to unpack. I mean, it makes you wonder, is a unified America really part of our destiny, or was it just like a lucky break? You know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean, yeah. Like, what if it could have easily gone the other way? Turtledove really makes you think about the dark potential that maybe was lurking beneath the surface all along.
Definitely. Makes you think. Okay, so what's next?
Well, let's shift gears a bit to a what if that kind of sends chills down my spine.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
What if, and this is a scary thought, what if Charles Lindbergh had become president?
Lindbergh, the aviator.
The one and only. But, you know, he was also known for his isolationist views.
And his not so great views on certain groups of people.
Right, exactly. And Philip Roth, he explored this in his novel, The Plot Against America. And it's a chilling look at what America might have become if Lindbergh's, let's just say, his sympathies had influenced his presidency.
So, like a darker America.
Much darker. Imagine an America that aligns itself with Nazi Germany.
Whoa. Instead of fighting against fascism, we become part of it. That's a terrifying thought.
Isn't it? And it makes you realize the immense power that a single person in a position of leadership can have, you know, for good or for evil.
Absolutely. Like one person can really change the course of history.
Right.
And not always for the better.
Right. So let's continue down this path a little bit further.
Yeah.
And explore another chilling possibility.
Okay, I'm ready.
What if Hitler had actually succeeded in his invasion of Russia?
Oh, man. That would have been a game changer.
It would have been. And Robert Harris, he wrote a novel called Fatherland, where this is exactly what happens. Hitler wins, and he becomes this revered figure through propaganda.
It's like a kind of a parallel to Stalin, right? Where total control is maintained through fear and manipulation.
Exactly. And it makes you think victory doesn't always mean justice, right?
Right. And power can corrupt no matter who holds it. It's a scary thought.
It is. Okay. Before we get too bogged down in these dark possibilities,
Yeah, good idea.
let's consider a what if with, well, potentially devastating global consequences.
Okay, I'm all ears.
What if the Cuban Missile Crisis had gone hot? You know, instead of a tense standoff, it escalated into full-blown nuclear war.
Oh, wow. That's a whole other level of scary. Like end of the world scary.
Right. And this is exactly what Brendan Dubois explores in Resurrection Day.
What happens? Does the world just end?
Pretty much, yeah. It's a decimated world, and the really ironic part is that America ends up as the sole remaining nuclear power.
So we're the ones who trigger the apocalypse. It's like we're so focused on winning that we lose sight of the bigger picture.
It's a pretty sobering thought, right? It makes you think about the unintended consequences of our actions, especially when you're talking about things like nuclear weapons.
For sure. One wrong move and everything's gone. It's a lot of responsibility.
Okay, let's do one more military what if and then move on. Yeah.
Sounds good to me. What else have we got?
So this is more of a classic European scenario. What if Napoleon had actually won at Waterloo and just kept conquering?
Napoleon. Man, that guy was ambitious. I mean, he already had a pretty big empire, didn't he?
He did, but apparently it wasn't enough. G.M. Trevelyan, he wrote this essay where Napoleon wins at Waterloo, England is severely weakened, and there's even a Byron-led rebellion.
Wait, Lord Byron, the poet.
The very same.
Yeah.
Apparently, in this alternate reality, he's a revolutionary leader.
That's pretty cool, actually. And what about South America? I remember that was a hotbed of revolution around that time, too.
You're right, and Trevelyan touches on that too. He suggests that Napoleon's victory in Europe would have emboldened South American revolutionaries even more, potentially leading to a much different geopolitical landscape in the Americas.
Wow, okay. So much for Napoleon just wanting a little slice of Europe, huh? His victory would have had a ripple effect across the globe.
It would have been massive. And what's even more interesting is that Trevelyan leaves the essay on a cliffhanger. Like he's daring us to imagine what happens next.
Oh, that's clever.
Yeah.
It's like he's saying, okay, here's the starting point, now you take it from here.
Exactly. He gives us the spark, and then it's up to our imaginations to see where the fire goes.
I like that. It definitely makes you think. Okay, so where do we go from Napoleon and the 19th century? Do we have more what-ifs from that era?
We do, but I think it's time to shift gears a little bit and explore a different kind of power.
Okay, I'm game. What are we talking about?
The power of language.
Oh, interesting. How does that fit into alternate history?
Well, let's consider what might have happened if the Romans had won the Battle of Teutoburg Forest.
Teutoburg Forest. Refresh my memory. I'm a little rusty on my Roman history.
So this was a battle that took place in 9 AD between the Romans and a bunch of Germanic tribes. It was a massive defeat for the Romans, and it basically stopped them from conquering Germania.
Okay, right. I vaguely remember that from history class. But how does this relate to language?
Well, Louis Lapham, he has this theory that if the Romans had won at Teutoburg Forest, they would have Romanized Germania, just like they did with Gaul and Hispania. Meaning Latin would have become the dominant language and Germanic languages would have been suppressed.
Ah, I see where you're going with this. So no German, no English. What would that world look like?
That's the question, right? It's mind-blowing to think that a single battle fought almost 2,000 years ago could have potentially erased entire languages and cultures from existence.
And think about the domino effect. No English means no Shakespeare, no American Revolution as we know it. It's a completely different world.
It is. It makes you realize just how much seemingly isolated events can shape the course of history, you know?
For sure. It's like those butterfly effect movies where one tiny change can lead to massive consequences down the line. Okay, so what else do we have?
Speaking of battles that could have reshaped the world, let's talk about Operation Sea Lion.
Ah, yes. Hitler's plan to invade Britain. What if he had actually pulled it off?
Well, the Royal Military Academy, they actually ran some war games to simulate this scenario, and the results were pretty interesting.
Okay, so they basically played out the invasion. What did they find?
Well, it turns out that Hitler might have underestimated the Brits, to put it mildly.
Really? How so?
The simulations showed that the Germans would have faced incredibly fierce resistance on the beaches, logistical nightmares trying to supply their troops.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Trying to cross the English Channel with an army. Yeah. Logistically, that's a nightmare.
Exactly. And of course, there's the Royal Air Force. The simulation showed that they would have just been relentless in their attacks. Basically, would have been a disaster for the Germans.
So even with all his planning, Hitler would have gotten bogged down in Britain. That's a pretty big what if.
It is, yeah. I think it reminds us that even the best laid plans can go awry.
Especially when you're up against an enemy that's determined to fight for its survival. Okay, so Britain holds strong against the Nazis. What happens next in this alternate timeline? Does World War II just drag on?
It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely throws a wrench in Hitler's plans for world domination.
For sure. It makes you wonder, though, if Britain holding out would have been enough to ultimately defeat Nazi Germany.
It's a question that historians will probably debate for centuries to come. But you know what? I think it's time we shift gears again.
Okay, sounds good. What are we exploring next?
Let's delve into the realm of culture and society. I'm really curious about these what-ifs because they get at the heart of how we understand ourselves and the world around us.
Definitely. Culture and society are the building blocks of civilization, so any changes there would have massive ripple effects.
Absolutely. So let's dive in. All right, so first up in the culture and society category,
Okay, hit me with it.
what if, and this is a big one, what if Christianity had completely missed the West?
Like it just never took hold.
Exactly. No missionaries, no conversions, just a different spiritual path for Europe.
That's interesting. So, like, what would that even look like? Would Europe still be the Europe we know?
Well, Charles Renouvier, a French philosopher, he explored this in his book, Uchronie.
Okay.
And he envisions a Europe where classical culture continues to thrive for centuries.
Instead of the Dark Ages and the rise of Christianity.
Right. It's almost like a continuation of ancient Greece and Rome.
Huh. So what happens to religion in this version of Europe?
Well, Renouvier suggests that this extended period of classical culture leads to a more tolerant society, one that embraces a variety of religious beliefs.
So like a more multicultural, multi-religious Europe.
Exactly. It's a pretty radical departure from the Europe we know, which was shaped so heavily by Christianity.
Yeah, no kidding. Makes you think about how much religion influenced, well, everything. Art, politics, even the way people thought about the world.
Absolutely. Okay, let's flip the script a bit and consider the opposite.
Okay, I'm ready for a twist.
What if, instead of Christianity fading away, the Catholic Church remained dominant? Like, no Reformation, no Protestant branches, just Catholicism ruling the roost.
Oh, wow. Okay, so like a super Catholic Europe. What would that look like?
Well, Kingsley Amis, he tackles this in his novel The Alteration, and it's a pretty wild ride.
Okay, tell me more.
Picture this, a Catholic-dominated Europe, but one that's kind of stuck in a technological dark age.
Wait, how does that happen?
Because the church suppresses scientific advancement. They even go so far as to ban electricity.
Whoa, seriously, why would they do that?
I guess Amos is suggesting that a powerful church might view scientific progress as a threat, you know?
Like it challenges their authority or their view of the world.
Exactly. It makes you think about how institutions, even religious ones, can sometimes hold back progress.
Yeah, when they get too much power, it can definitely stifle things. It makes you appreciate the Reformation a little bit more.
Yeah.
You know, like at least it shook things up and got people thinking differently.
Yeah, I know, right? Okay, I'm ready for something a little lighter.
Me too. All this religion and war is getting a bit heavy.
Okay, well, let's move away from these grand historical shifts and consider something a bit closer to, well, Hollywood.
Ooh, Hollywood. Okay, I'm listening.
What if James Dean had survived that car crash?
James Dean, the rebel without a cause. But he died so young.
I know, tragically young. But Jack Dan, he explores this possibility in his novel, The Rebel, and it gets pretty interesting.
Okay, so James Dean lives. What happens next?
Well, imagine Elvis Presley, inspired by Dean, decides to become an actor instead of a musician.
Elvis the actor. That's a wild thought.
Right. And then there's Dean himself. He goes on to become the governor of California.
Hold on. James Dean as governor. Would he be like a super cool governor? Like leather jacket and all?
I don't know about the leather jacket, but it definitely shakes things up. He even potentially prevents the rise of Ronald Reagan.
Whoa. Okay, so like a totally different political landscape in California?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe even on a national level.
Exactly. It's a reminder that sometimes the presence or absence of a single individual can have massive ripple effects.
Yeah, like a butterfly flapping its wings and causing a hurricane on the other side of the world. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. Okay, so what about these individual destinies you mentioned? Any more juicy what-ifs along those lines?
Oh, definitely. And I think a good place to start would be with, well, JFK.
JFK. Okay, yeah, I can see how that one would spark a lot of what-ifs. What if he hadn't been assassinated?
Exactly. And Robert Dallek, a Kennedy biographer, he suggests a pretty optimistic scenario.
Okay, let's hear it.
He imagines a world where JFK successfully navigates the Vietnam War.
So no escalation, no long drawn-out conflict.
Right. He pulls the U.S. out, and potentially this leads to a Kennedy dynasty in American politics.
A Kennedy dynasty. Like a political family that just dominates for generations.
That's the idea. It's a pretty stark contrast to the turbulent 60s and 70s that we know, right?
Yeah, no kidding. It's like in this alternate timeline, the 60s are all peace and love, man.
Maybe not all peace and love, but definitely a different vibe. However, not everyone is so optimistic about a surviving JFK.
Really?
Yeah.
What do they say?
Well, some writers, they envision a much darker outcome.
Oh, no. What kind of dark outcome?
Like anti-war protests escalate into full-blown riots.
Yikes. So instead of peace and love, It's chaos and violence.
Pretty much, yeah. And on top of that, you have Cold War tensions pushing the world to the brink of World War III.
Oh, man. So surviving the assassination doesn't necessarily mean a happy ending for JFK or for the world, huh?
Right. It's a reminder that even with the benefit of hindsight, predicting the course of history is tricky.
Yeah, there are always unintended consequences. Okay, so we've got the optimistic JFK and the not so optimistic JFK. What else do we have?
Well, we've got to talk about Peter Hitchens' take on JFK.
Okay, and what does Hitchens have to say?
He wrote this fictitious obituary.
An obituary. For someone who, in this scenario, is still alive, that's kind of morbid.
I know, right? But it's Hitchens' way of exploring what he sees as JFK's failed legacy.
Failed legacy. But JFK is usually portrayed as, like, a hero, right?
He is, but Hitchens paints a much more cynical picture.
Okay, so, like, what does this failed legacy look like, according to Hitchens?
Well, he argues that JFK's policies ultimately paved the way for decades of Republican dominance.
Whoa, okay, so like a complete reversal of the political landscape we know.
Exactly. And he suggests that JFK's charisma masked a lack of substance, like he was all style and no substance.
Interesting. It just goes to show that even the most iconic figures can be interpreted in wildly different ways.
It's all about perspective, right? Okay, let's move on to someone who's just as iconic, but in a very different way.
Okay, who are we talking about now?
Marilyn Monroe. What if she hadn't died in 1962?
Marilyn Monroe. Oh, that's a good one. So many possibilities.
I know, right? And the book explores a few different scenarios.
Okay, lay 'em on me. What might have happened to Marilyn?
Well, Mark Lawson, he imagines a world where her affair with JFK becomes public.
Ooh, that's juicy. So like a major scandal that rocks the presidency.
Exactly. It's a very different image of Marilyn. Not just the tragic starlet, but someone who could potentially bring down a president.
Wow, okay. What other possibilities are there?
Well, Douglas Menden, he has a much more, let's say, wholesome take.
Okay, wholesome Marilyn. I'm intrigued.
He imagines her escaping the pressures of Hollywood, winning an Oscar, and eventually focusing on raising her sons.
Oh, that's sweet. Yeah. So, like, she finds peace and happiness away from the spotlight.
Exactly. It's a much more optimistic vision of her life.
Yeah, definitely a happier ending than the real-life story. Okay, but I have to ask, are there any really out there theories about what might have happened to Marilyn?
Oh, absolutely. You can't talk about Marilyn Monroe without venturing into the realm of conspiracy theories.
Right. Like, was it really an overdose? Was she murdered? Did she fake her own death?
Exactly. And The Sun, they have this theory about her being brainwashed and relocated to Australia.
But what? Brainwashed and sent to Australia? That's a new one.
I know, right? It's pretty out there, but hey, that's part of the fun of alternate history. Exploring all the wild possibilities.
Definitely. Okay, so we've covered some pretty heavy hitters in this individual destinies category. JFK, Marilyn Monroe. Who else is on the list?
Well, let's move back to the world of music, but with a twist.
Okay, a musical twist. I like it. What are we thinking about?
What if Frank Sinatra had never existed?
No Sinatra. But his music is so iconic. It's like the soundtrack to a whole era.
I know, right? But this scenario, it comes from an episode of Family Guy, so take it with a grain of salt.
Family Guy. Okay, so we're going full-on comedy now.
Pretty much, yeah. But they actually make a pretty interesting point.
Okay, let's hear it. What happens in a world without Sinatra?
Well, according to Family Guy, Nixon becomes president.
Nixon. But wasn't he president anyway?
He was, but they're suggesting that without Sinatra's influence, things go even worse for Nixon.
Oh, I see. So, like, he's even more corrupt, more paranoid.
Exactly. And this leads to a botched Cuban Missile Crisis and ultimately nuclear war.
Whoa, okay, so no Sinatra means World War III. That's a pretty big leap.
It is, but it's a humorous way of highlighting how even seemingly unrelated events can have these crazy interconnected consequences.
Yeah, I guess you never know what little thing might set off a chain reaction. It's like that butterfly effect again. Speaking of unexpected connections, what about the what if with Shakespeare?
Ah, yes. The one where he's not just a playwright, but a historian.
Wait, Shakespeare the historian? What does that even mean?
Well, in Poul Anderson's A Midsummer Tempest, Shakespeare's plays are taken as historical fact. Like, his plays are literally accurate accounts of historical events.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. This proves the existence of magic.
Hold on, magic? Like, real, actual magic?
Yep, and this leads to an earlier industrial revolution powered by both technology and sorcery.
Wow, okay. So we've got Shakespeare, the historian magician, and a world where magic is real. That's a pretty wild combination.
It is, right. It makes you think about how our perception of history shapes our understanding of the world.
Definitely. And how accepting something as fact, even something as fantastical as magic, can have a huge impact on how society develops.
Exactly. Okay, we're almost through our list of what ifs.
Already. Time flies when you're having fun with alternate history.
It does. Yeah. Okay, let's wrap things up with a couple more what ifs
Yeah.
about some pretty pivotal figures in American history.
All right, shoot. Who are we talking about?
First up, Woodrow Wilson. What if he'd never been president?
Woodrow Wilson. Okay, so we're back to presidents. What would a world without Wilson look like? Well, Gore Vidal, in his novel The Smithsonian Institution, he suggests that without Wilson's push for the League of Nations, World War II might have been avoided.
Really? How so?
He blames the League for contributing to Germany's post-war struggles, which in turn fueled the rise of Hitler.
Ah, I see. So it's like this well-intentioned effort to prevent future wars actually backfires and makes things worse.
Exactly. It's a reminder that good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes, especially in the messy world of international relations.
Yeah, unintended consequences and all that. It's
Yeah.
a tough lesson to learn. Okay, one last what if to round things out.
Yes. And this one's a little different. We've talked about presidents, dictators, playwrights, but what about a classic rom-com?
A rom-com. Okay, now I'm really curious. Which one are we talking about?
Pretty Woman. What if, instead of Gary Marshall, it had been directed by Martin Scorsese?
Wait, what? Scorsese, the guy who directed Goodfellas and Taxi Driver, directing a romantic comedy.
I know, it's a wild thought, right? But Empire Magazine, they actually imagined this scenario.
Okay, I'm all ears. What happens to Pretty Woman in Scorsese's hands?
Well, first of all, it's retitled The Happy Hooker.
The Happy Hooker. Okay, that's already a very different vibe.
Right, and instead of a heartwarming romance, it becomes a gritty, tragic tale.
Whoa, okay, so like a complete 180 from the original.
Exactly. And get this, it ends with Julia Roberts' character dying from a heroin overdose.
Oh, wow. That's dark. Like, really dark.
Yeah, it's a pretty bleak take on the classic fairy tale ending.
It makes you wonder, like, how much of a story is shaped by the person telling it. You take the same basic plot, but with a different director, a different vision, and you end up with a completely different movie.
It's amazing, isn't it, how a single change can completely transform a story.
Definitely. And it makes you think about all the different ways history could have unfolded, all the paths not taken. It's kind of overwhelming, actually.
It is, isn't it? But also kind of exciting. Wow, we've really gone down the rabbit hole with these what ifs, huh?
We have. From presidents to pop stars to a magic-wielding Shakespeare, we've covered a lot of ground.
It's amazing how these alternate histories, even though they're just speculation, can really make you think about the world in a whole new way.
Absolutely. They highlight the interconnectedness of events, the choices people make, and the unexpected twists and turns that shape the course of history. It's like you start to see all these hidden patterns and possibilities that you might not have considered before.
Yeah, and it makes you realize that history isn't this, like, fixed, predetermined thing.
Exactly. It's not just a straight line from point A to point B.
More like a tangled web, right? With all these different threads intertwining and influencing each other.
A perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And any one of those threads, if you pull on it a little differently, could lead to a completely different outcome.
So out of all these what ifs we've explored, which one really stood out to you?
That's a tough one. There are so many fascinating scenarios to choose from, but I think the ones that really got me thinking were the ones that dealt with individual destinies, like JFK and Marilyn Monroe.
Oh, yeah, those were definitely thought-provoking.
It makes you wonder about the power of individual choices, you know? Like if JFK had made a different decision about Vietnam, or if Marilyn had chosen a different path in life, how would that have rippled outward and changed the world?
It's like that butterfly effect again.
Yeah.
One small change, and who knows what might happen.
Exactly. And it's not just about famous people either. It applies to all of us, in a way. Every choice we make, every action we take, have the potential to create a ripple effect, even if we don't see it right away.
It makes you think about the choices you make every day, huh? Like, what if I had chosen a different career path? Or what if I had moved to a different city?
Exactly. It's a bit mind-boggling, but also kind of liberating, don't you think? To realize that we have the power to shape our own destinies and maybe even influence the course of history in some small way.
I like that way of looking at it. So for our listeners out there, what if really resonated with you? What historical event or figure would you like to explore in an alternate reality? Share your thoughts with us. We'd love to hear from you.
And keep in mind, even though these alternate histories are fun to think about, they can also teach us valuable lessons about our own world.
Right. They can help us see the past in a new light, and maybe even make us more aware of the choices we're making in the present.
Exactly, because the choices we make today will become the history of tomorrow. So let's choose wisely.
Well said. And on that note, I think we'll wrap up our deep dive into alternate history. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the what ifs.
It's been a pleasure. And remember, the possibilities are endless. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep imagining all the different ways history could have unfolded. You never know what fascinating discoveries you might make along the way.
Until next time.